Namaste, everyone. Welcome to Bhartiya Darshnik Manch. Today we are back with another episode of Western philosophy. Okay, let's get right into it. We're taking a deep dive into logic, that essential toolkit for sorting out good arguments from the not-so-good ones,
Exactly. And Aristotle is often, credited as the founder of this field.
which holds up pretty well, that claim.
It does. But we shouldn't overlook Plato either. He made some really fundamental distinctions, like between nouns and verbs, that were crucial early steps in logical thinking.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a variety of sources to really explore the core ideas of logic.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that while humans, we've always argued, right, and pointed out flawed reasoning,
Sure, seems natural.
but it was the ancient Greeks, particularly Aristotle and then later the Stoics, who gave us the first really systematic ways to understand why some arguments are sound and others just, well, aren't.
So our mission today, then.
Our mission, yeah, is to unpack these foundational concepts. We'll focus on Aristotle's syllogistic logic, then look at how the Stoics developed propositional logic.
And pull out the key insights that are still incredibly relevant for, thinking clearly today.
Precisely.
So let's dive in with Aristotle's prior analytics. This really gets to the core of his logic, the syllogism.
Ah, yes, the syllogism.
You might recall this from your studies, maybe. Essentially, a syllogism is this specific kind of argument where a conclusion has to follow from two statements, the premises.
Right. The classic example, one Aristotle himself would definitely recognize, is every Greek is human. Every human is mortal.
Therefore, every Greek is mortal. Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it?
It does on the surface.
Yeah.
But Aristotle went much, much further in analyzing the actual structure. He didn't just give examples.
Okay, how so?
Well, to really get a handle on these argument forms, he developed a whole precise set of terms. He defined a syllogismus. What we call a syllogism is a kind of discourse where something different necessarily follows just from what you've stated.
Okay, so the initial statements force the conclusion.
Exactly. And each of those sentences in our example, like every Greek is human, when it's in that declarative form, he called a protasis, or a proposition.
A proposition, got it.
The sentence starting with, therefore, that's the conclusion, obviously.
And the other two are the premises. Makes sense.
He also made distinctions between universal propositions, the ones starting with every or no, they could be affirmative like every or negative like no.
Right.
And particular propositions, those starting with some, again, affirmative or negative, some are not.
And the basic building blocks of these propositions, the words themselves.
He called them terms, or horoi. These are basically the subjects and predicates in our statements.
Okay, so in our example, every Greek is human. Every human is mortal. Therefore, every Greek is mortal. Let's break that down with these terms.
So, mortal is the major term. It's the predicate of the conclusion, what the conclusion is saying about the subject.
Right, what Greeks are.
Greek is the minor term. That's the subject of the conclusion.
The thing we're talking about.
And human, which you see pops up in both premises, but not in the conclusion. That's the crucial middle term. It links the other two.
Okay. So that middle term is doing the connecting work behind the scenes. How did Aristotle start to see the patterns in all this then, beyond just one example?
Well, this was truly groundbreaking. He introduced schematic letters. Instead of just using examples like Greeks and mortals, he used letters A, B, C to stand in for any terms.
Like variables in math.
Exactly like that. You let him reveal the fundamental structure of the argument, independent of the content. So our example becomes, if A belongs to every B and B belongs to every C, then A belongs to every C.
Wow. Okay, so that takes it to a whole new level of abstraction.
It really does. The insight is moving beyond specific examples to the underlying form. It's like figuring out grammar rules that work no matter which words you plug in. He preferred outlining these abstract patterns first, then thinking about what specific terms could substitute for A, B, and C.
Right, moving from the specific instance to the general rule. Very powerful. Now, Aristotle didn't stop there, did he? He noticed something about that middle term.
He did. He observed that the position of the middle term within the two premises actually created different argument structures. He called these figures, or schemata.
Figures? Okay, how many?
He identified three main figures. In the first figure, the middle term is the predicate in one premise and the subject in the other, like our Greek is human example. Human is predicate of Greek and subject of mortal.
Okay, first figure. What about the others?
In the second figure, the middle term is the predicate in both premises. And in the third figure, it's the subject in both premises.
Huh. So you can visualize that. If we use S for the minor term, subject of conclusion, M for middle, and P for major, predicate of conclusion.
Exactly. You can map it out. First figure might look like MP, SM, therefore SP. Second is PM, SM, therefore SP. Third is MP, MS, therefore SP. You see the different arrangements in M.
Yeah, clearly. And Aristotle had a favorite, didn't he?
He did. He seemed to think the first figure was the most complete, or maybe perfect. Probably because the logical connection feels the most direct and obvious in that form.
Makes sense. It flows nicely.
And within each of these figures, Aristotle then identified different moods of the syllogism.
Moods, like happy or sad logic.
Not quite. Moods are just the different combinations of those proposition types we mentioned. Universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative.
Ah, okay. So combining the A, E, I, O propositions, as they were later called.
Precisely. So even within the first figure, you can have different mixes. For instance, every Greek is human. A, no human is immortal. E, therefore no Greek is immortal. E, that's one mood.
But, and this is important, just because something looks like it fits one of these patterns doesn't mean it's actually a valid argument, right?
Absolutely critical point. Our sources point this out clearly. Consider this. Some animals are dogs. Some dogs are white. Therefore, every animal is white.
Okay, that clearly doesn't work. The conclusion is false, even if the premises might be true.
Right. It looks structurally a bit like a first figure syllogism. But it has true premises and a potentially false conclusion. That proves the form itself is invalid. You can't rely on it.
So how did Aristotle sort the good forms from the bad ones? How did he figure out which moods were valid?
Well, essentially, he systematically examined different pairs of premises within each figure to see if a conclusion necessarily followed. If you could find even one counterexample with true premises and a false conclusion, that form was out.
Trial and error on the forms, almost.
In a way, but a very systematic way. Through this, he developed general rules that had to apply to all valid syllogisms, regardless of figure.
Like what? Any examples?
Sure. Like you must have at least one universal premise, all or no. You can't get a conclusion just from two sum statements.
Okay, that seems intuitive.
And you need at least one affirmative premise. Two negative premises don't prove anything definitively. Also, if one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. And if the conclusion is negative, one premise must be too.
Right, those make sense. Any rules just for his favorite, the first figure?
Yes, for the first figure specifically, he laid down two more crucial rules. The major premise, the one containing the major term, P, must be universal, A or E.
Okay, the first statement needs to be about all or none.
And the minor premise, the one with the minor term S, must be affirmative, A or I. It has to say is not, is not.
Got it. So applying all those rules, the general ones and the specific first figure ones.
Aristotle concluded that there are only 4 valid moods within the first figure. These were later given mnemonic names like Barbara, Celerant, Dari, Ferio, based on the vowel codes A, E, I, O.
4 perfect forms in the first figure. But what about those second and third figure syllogisms, ones that weren't quite as neat?
Good question. Aristotle, being Aristotle, couldn't just leave them hanging. He developed methods to analyze them too, primarily through something called conversion or anti-ostrophy.
Conversion, what does that involve?
It involves swapping the subject and predicate in certain types of propositions while keeping the truth value the same.
Ah, okay. Give me an example.
So some S is P is logically the same as some P is S. If some dogs are mammals, then some mammals are dogs. That works.
Okay.
And no S is P is the same as no P is S. If no cats are dogs, then no dogs are cats. Also works.
Right. But does it always work? Like for every S is P?
No. That's the crucial exception. Every S is P does not necessarily mean every P is S. Think about it. Every square is a rectangle.
But not every rectangle is a square. Gotcha. So conversion only works reliably for E, universal negative, and particular affirmative propositions.
Exactly. So he could use these valid conversions to sometimes transform a second or third figure syllogism into an equivalent first figure one, which he already knew how to validate.
Clever. What if conversion didn't work, though?
For those tougher cases, he used a technique called reductio ad absurdum, reduction to absurdity.
Sounds traumatic.
It kind of is. Think of it like winning an argument by showing your opponent's view leads to a completely ridiculous or contradictory conclusion.
Okay, prove it wrong indirectly.
Precisely. In logic, you'd assume the negation of the conclusion you're trying to prove. Then you show that this assumption, combined with one of your original premises, leads logically, often via a valid first-figure syllogism, to a conclusion that contradicts your other original premise.
So you show that assuming the opposite leads to an impossible situation.
Exactly. If assuming the opposite is impossible, then the original conclusion must be true. It's an indirect proof.
Wow. That's quite a system he built.
It really was. Aristotle's syllogistic was groundbreaking, the first formal, systematic way of analyzing a big chunk of logical reasoning. Now, Kant later claimed it was the complete science of logic, which was definitely an overstatement.
Right. History showed otherwise.
But its impact on the history of thought is just undeniable.
Absolutely. But as impressive as it was, you hinted it wasn't the whole story of logic, right? There were limitations.
Definitely. It's really only a fragment of logic when you look at the bigger picture. One major limitation is that it mainly deals with those quantifiers, all and some, and how they work within subject-predicate sentences.
Okay.
It doesn't really have the tools to handle inferences that depend on logical connectives like if, then, or connectives that link whole sentences or propositions together rather than just relating terms within sentences.
Can you give an example of that kind of inference?
Sure, a very simple one that the Stoics later formalized is, if it is not day, it is night. But it is not day, therefore it is night.
Right. That seems obviously valid, but it doesn't fit the SMP structure of a syllogism at all.
Not neatly, no. The crucial insight the Stoics brought was realizing that logic isn't just about the terms inside a sentence, but also about how entire statements connect to each other.
Okay, that's a big shift in perspective. Any other limitations to Aristotle's system?
Another key one was its difficulty with quantifiers that show up inside the predicate of a sentence. Think about every boy loves some girl.
Ah, okay. The some girl is part of what's being said about every boy. That sounds more complex.
It is much more complex for his system. Aristotle's rules weren't really designed to handle that kind of nested quantification. It took centuries, really until modern logic, for logicians to develop good ways to formalize inferences like that.
So even Aristotle probably saw his system wasn't the final word.
It seems likely. The sources suggest he recognized its limitations, even if he didn't fully develop the alternative branches of logic himself.
This brings us to his other logical works, maybe? Like the De Interpretatione? Does that fill some gaps?
It shifts the focus a bit. While De Interpretatione still talks about those general propositions its main goal isn't really building syllogisms. It's more about exploring the relationships between these propositions. How are they compatible or incompatible?
Okay, so how different kinds of statements relate to each other? Like what?
Well, here we get concepts like contraries. These are pairs of propositions that cannot both be true, though they can both be false. Every man is white, and no man is white. If one is true, the other must be false. But it's possible that neither is true, right? Maybe some men are white and some are not.
Ah, I see. So they conflict, but don't cover all possibilities between them.
Exactly. Then you have contradictories. These are pairs where one must be true and the other must be false. They can't both be true and they can't both be false either. They're exact opposites.
Okay.
Like every man is white and it's contradictory. Some man is not white, or no man is white and it's contradictory. Some man is white. One of these pair has to be true, the other false.
Got it. Total opposition.
And Aristotle also touched on what later got called subcontraries. These are the particular propositions. Some man is white and some man is not white.
How do they relate?
They can both be true, some are, some aren't, but they cannot both be false. Assuming men exist, at least one of those must be true.
Okay, that's a bit more subtle.
It is. And all these relationships, contraries, contradictories, subcontraries, and also subalternation, which relates universals to particulars, were later visualized really neatly by Aristotle's followers in the famous square of opposition.
Right. I remember seeing that diagram. It maps it all out visually.
The very handy tool. And it's worth noting, the interpretation is mostly focused on these general propositions. Well, some, no. And contrasts them with singular proposition statements about specific individuals, like Socrates is wise.
Okay, so the interpretation looks at statement relationships, prior analytics at argument structure. What about the categories? Where does that fit in?
The categories takes yet another angle. It starts by dividing things that are said into two types, complex and simple.
Complex and simple sayings.
Yeah, complex sayings are basically complete sentences like, a man is running. These are the kinds of things that can be true or false.
Okay, assertions.
Right. Simple sayings are the individual words that make up those sentences, nouns and verbs like man, running.
Yeah.
On their own, these simple sayings are neither true nor false. They're just words.
The ingredients?
Kind of. So in one sense, Aristotle is looking at the basic ingredients of language here. But remember, in the prior analytics, his focus shifts to how these ingredients, these terms, are arranged and related using all or some in a syllogism. Two slightly different ways of looking at language.
And in the categories, he famously lists the categories, right?
Exactly. His 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, posture, wearing, doing, and being acted on.
That's the list. What do they represent?
They represent the different fundamental kinds of things you can say about an individual subject.
Yeah.
The different kinds of predicates. So you take an individual like Socrates.
Okay, our primary substance.
Precisely. That's a key distinction Aristotle makes right there within the category of substance itself. He distinguishes primary substance, the individual thing, like Socrates, or this specific chair.
The concrete particular.
Yes. And secondary substances, which are the species and genera that primary substances belong to. So human is a species Socrates belongs to, animals, the genus, those are secondary substances.
Okay, so Socrates is the primary substance. What about the other 9 categories?
Predicates from the other 9 categories, quantity, quality, relation, etc., are said to be in a subject. They describe characteristics of a primary substance. So Socrates has a certain quantity, maybe 5'8", a certain quality-wise. He's in relation to Plato, his student. He's in a place, Athens, at a time, in a posture, maybe wearing a tunic, doing philosophy, and being acted on by, say, Hemlock eventually.
Right, you can describe him using potentially all 10 kinds of predicates.
That's the idea. The categories also gets into other interesting logical points like homonymy and synonymy.
Okay, what are those?
Synonymy is pretty simple. When things share the same name and the same definition or meaning, like calling 2 different dogs, both dog, same name, same essential meaning.
Makes sense. Homonymy.
That's when things share the same name, but have different meanings or definitions. Like the bank of a river versus a financial bank. Same word, different concepts.
Ah, ambiguity.
Exactly. And Aristotle points out this is really important for spotting fallacies in arguments, where someone might subtly shift the meaning of a word mid-argument. Understanding homonymy helps you catch that.
Very useful.
He even talks about analogies as sort of more interesting type of homonymy, where the meanings aren't completely different, but are related in some structured way. Like the word healthy applies differently to a person, their diet, or their complexion, but all meanings relate back to the core concept of health.
Okay, that's quite nuanced. So looking at categories de interpretazione and prior analytics together, it seems Aristotle approached language and propositions in slightly different ways.
That's a really important observation, actually. You can see 2 somewhat different conceptions of how a proposition is structured in his works.
Yes.
In the categories and de interpretazione, maybe influenced more by Plato, he often talks about a sentence as being made of fundamentally different parts, a noun part and verb part, heterogeneous elements.
Okay, subject and action description.
Right. But in the prior analytics, where he's building the syllogistic, he treats a proposition as constructed from terms. And these terms seem more alike, more homogeneous, that they can swap roles, functioning as either subject or predicate, depending on the proposition.
So human can be a subject or a predicate.
Exactly. And while you obviously need things like quantifiers and the copula, is or are, to actually form the proposition for a syllogism, Aristotle's focus in that work is much more on the terms of the quantifiers and how they relate, and less on the function of the copula itself.
Interesting. Did this difference cause any problems?
It could lead to some potential confusion, especially about the precise relationship between the words, the signs, and the things or concepts they signify, the terms or predicates. It's a subtle point, but highlights the complexities he was grappling with.
Right. Now, another area Aristotle grappled with was time and modality, wasn't it? Necessity and possibility.
Yes, absolutely. He had a view that might seem a bit different from modern logic. He clearly recognized that the truth value of many propositions could change over time.
Like your example, Theaetetus is sitting. True now, false later.
Exactly. He saw the proposition itself as changing its truth value. This contrasts with a more common modern view where you'd say Theaetetus is sitting at time t1 is a timelessly true or false proposition, and Theaetetus is sitting at time t2 is a different timeless proposition. Aristotle seemed to think the proposition persisted and changed truth value.
Okay, that's a different way of thinking about it. How did that lead into necessity and possibility?
Well, it led him to distinguish between contingent propositions, those whose truth value can change, like Theaetetus is sitting, and necessary propositions, those which cannot change their truth value, perhaps like 2 + 2 = 4, or humans are rational animals in his view.
Okay, things that must be true or must be false.
Right. And he explored Modal propositions,
Huh.
explicitly, statements involving must be necessity and can be or cannot be possibility. He noticed negation works differently with modals.
How so?
Well, the negation of A can be B isn't A cannot be B. It's stronger. A cannot be B or A must not be B.
Ah, right. Possibility versus impossibility.
Exactly. He actually worked out the relationships between possible, impossible, necessary, and not necessary, even setting them up in a kind of square of opposition, similar to the one for categorical propositions. He also noted that possible could sometimes mean contingent, that is, neither necessary nor impossible, possible in both directions.
That modal square sounds interesting. Where did he really dig into the time aspect of modality?
One of the most famous and debated parts is in Chapter 9 of De Interpretatione. Here he connects tense, past, present, future, directly with modality.
Okay, what was the argument?
He argued that for propositions about the present or the past, one part of the contradiction, either the affirmation or the negation, is necessarily true or false. Not necessarily in a deep logical sense, but more in the sense that what's done is done, or what is, is. You can't change the past or the present instant.
Okay, the settledness of the past and present.
Right. But this led him to a puzzle about the future. If it was true yesterday that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, does that mean that the sea battle today is now necessary? Does the past truth lock in the future event?
Ah, the famous sea battle problem. The problem of future contingents.
That's the one. Aristotle presents a pretty strong-sounding argument, suggesting that if future tense statements already have a definite truth value in the past or present, that all future events must be necessary. It smells like fatalism.
But he didn't accept that conclusion, did he?
No, he ultimately rejected it. He argued forcefully that not everything happens by necessity. There is genuine chance and contingency in the world. He uses an example of a cloak. It's possible it will be cut up before it wears out, but it's also possible it will wear out first. Neither is necessary.
So how did he resolve the tension with the idea of past truths about the future?
His resolution is a bit subtle, and maybe not fully satisfying to everyone later. He seems to say that while a future contingent statement can be true now, for example, there will be a sea battle might be true, it isn't true in the same necessary way that a present or past statement is true. He says something like, everything is necessary when it is, but that does not mean it is necessary, period.
Necessary when it happens, but not necessary before it happens.
Something like that. It acknowledges the event's contingency beforehand. However, the problem of how a statement about the future can be true now without making the future event necessary. That's a knot he didn't fully untangle, at least not in a way that satisfied all later philosophers.
It sounds like a really tricky area. Did this uncertainty affect his other logical work?
It seems it did. When Aristotle tried to build a system of modal syllogistic in the prior analytics, that's syllogisms using premises like A must be B or A can be C, it's generally seen as, well, not very successful. Even in antiquity, people found problems with it. It likely stemmed from his own indecision or lack of a single clear analysis of what modal propositions fundamentally mean. As our source material suggests, maybe a robust modal logic really needed a better foundation in propositional logic, first understanding the if-then connections, which is exactly where the Stoics picked up the baton.
Ah, okay. So Aristotle hit a wall with modality, and the next generation, the Stoics and Megarians, take a different path.
Exactly. In the generation after Aristotle, logic moved in a really new and interesting direction, especially concerning modality and propositional connections. Take Diodorus Kronos, a Megarian philosopher.
Oh yeah, what was his take?
He defined possibility based entirely on time. For him, something is possible if it is true now or will be true at some point in the future.
So only what actually happens or will happen is possible.
Pretty much. Impossibility was what is false now and will never be true. And necessity was what is true now and will never be false. Like Aristotle, he thought propositions were tensed and could change truth values.
But those definitions sound very deterministic, fatalistic even.
They absolutely led to a form of fatalism. His famous master argument tried to prove this, that only the actual past, present, or future is possible. Though the argument itself seems to rely on a questionable premise about the necessity of past truths, similar to the problem Aristotle wrestled with.
So did anyone challenge Diodorus?
Yes, his own student, Philo. Philo offered a different view of possibility, suggesting it depended more on the internal nature or properties of a proposition itself, not just whether it happens to be true at some time.
Okay, a non-temporal view of possibility.
Right. But Philo's most significant contribution, the one that really paved the way for the Stoics, was his definition of the conditional, the if P then Q statement.
How did he define it?
He gave what we now call the truth functional definition. If P then Q is false, only in the case where P, the antecedent, is true and Q, the consequent, is false. In all other combinations, true, true, false, false, the conditional statement is considered true.
Wow, that sounds very much like the material implication in modern logic.
It's incredibly close, a massive step. Now, because Philo, like Diodorus and Aristotle, still thought propositions could change truth value over time, his definition could lead to some slightly weird-sounding results by modern standards, like if it is night, it is day, being true whenever it's not night. But the core idea was revolutionary.
And the Stoics ran with this.
They did. The Stoic logicians really embraced Philo's conditional, or something very like it, and built a formal system of propositional logic on that kind of foundation.
How did their approach differ from Aristotle's overall?
Several key ways. Firstly, as we touched on, where Aristotle used letters for terms within a sentence, the Stoics used numbers, or perhaps just ordinals like the first, the second, as variables standing for entire propositions or sentence-like elements.
A shift from term logic to propositional logic.
Exactly. Secondly, their propositional logic wasn't isolated. It was deeply embedded within a broader theory of language and meaning. They made careful distinctions.
Like what?
They distinguished between the physical sound, the word spoken, the act of speech itself, and the lecton.
Lecton, what's that?
The lecton is the intangible content or meaning expressed by a sentence. It's the sayable, or the what is meant. Think of it as the underlying thought or proposition that can be true or false, independent of the particular words or language used to express it. It's not the sound, and it's not the external object being talked about, but the meaning itself.
Okay, that's a sophisticated idea. The abstract meaning.
Very. And they defined an axioma as a complete, assertable lecton one that is definitely either true or false. It's their version of a proposition. But crucially, like Aristotle's, these axiomata could change their truth value over time. It is day, is true now, false later.
Got it. And how did they build their logic from these axiomata?
They distinguish between simple axiomata, like it is day or Dion is walking, and non-simple or compound ones. Compound propositions were formed using logical connectives.
Like if, then.
Yes, if then,
Yeah.
but also since and either or.
Hmm.
Their analysis of how these connectives worked and how they determined the truth value of the compound propositions was where they made huge strides towards a truth-functional propositional calculus.
Were there differences from modern propositional logic, though?
Oh, definitely. Some interesting ones. For instance, they actually classified negative propositions like not, it is day, as simple, not compound. It seems they saw negation as operating on the core assertion itself. They were very careful about the scope of negation, emphasizing that you negate the entire proposition, not P, rather than just a part of it.
Okay, that's precise. What about or?
There's actually some scholarly debate about whether their or was typically inclusive A or B or both, like in modern logic, or exclusive.
Yeah.
A or B, but not both. Evidence might point towards exclusive, but it's not entirely certain.
And they included non-truth functional connectives, too, like since.
Yes, P since Q was one of their compound types, and its truth clearly depends on more than just the truth values of P and Q. It implies a causal or explanatory link. So their system wasn't purely truth functional in the modern sense.
What about the conditional, the if-then? Did they fully accept Philo's purely truth functional definition?
That's another area of debate. Sextus Empiricus, a later skeptic who reported on Stoic logic, attributes the Philonian definition to them. However, he also suggests that Chrysippus, the leading Stoic logician, might have preferred a stricter definition requiring some kind of connection or conflict between the content of the antecedent and the consequent. Not just any true statement following any false one makes a true conditional.
So maybe a relevance condition?
Possibly. The idea seems to be that for if P then Q to be true, the negation of Q must somehow conflict with P. It's not perfectly clear, but it suggests they grappled with the same counterintuitive aspects of the purely truth-functional conditional that students still puzzle over today.
Interesting. How did they define a valid argument or inference, then?
They called a valid inference parentikos. Their definition was quite sophisticated. An inference, like premise 1, premise 2, therefore conclusion, is valid if the contradictory of the conclusion conflicts logically with the conjunction, the and, of the premises.
Okay, let me unpack that. If the premises are true, the opposite of the conclusion must be false.
Essentially, yes. If you assert the premises but deny the conclusion, you create a logical impossibility or conflict. If there's no such conflict, The inference form is invalid.
And they distinguish valid from sound.
They did. An inference could be valid in its form, but still unsound if one or more of its premises were actually false. A sound argument had to be both valid in form and have true premises.
That's the modern distinction, too. Did they have basic argument forms like Aristotle's syllogisms?
Yes, Chrysippus identified 5 basic, underived valid inference forms, which he called the indemonstrables, or anapodictoi. These involved connectives like if-then, or and negation, using numerical placeholders for the propositions.
Can you give an example?
The most famous is modus ponens. If the first, then the second, but the first, therefore the second. Another is modus tollens. If the first, then the second, but not the second, therefore not the first.
Right. Fundamental patterns of propositional logic.
Exactly. And Chrysippus believed, quite ambitiously, that all valid inferences in their system could ultimately be reduced to combinations of these 5 basic indemonstrable forms using a few transformation rules.
Wow. So they aimed for a complete system of propositional logic.
You certainly laid the foundations for one. So looking back, it's fascinating. In antiquity, Aristotelian logic, term-based, and Stoic logic, propositional-based, were often seen as rivals, as competing systems.
But now,
With the benefit of hindsight and the development of modern logic, we see them quite differently. We recognize them as largely complementary, not competing. Aristotle pioneered the logic of terms and quantification, what became predicate calculus, while the Stoics pioneered the logic of propositions and connectives, propositional calculus.
both essential parts of the broader picture of logic as we understand it today.
Precisely. They were both crucial precursors to the integrated systems of modern symbolic logic. Understanding both gives you a much richer appreciation for how our tools for reasoning developed over centuries.
So, as we conclude this deep dive into ancient logical thought, we've really traced quite a journey. From Aristotle's foundational work on syllogisms, his explorations of propositions, terms, categories,
All the way to the Stoics' really groundbreaking development of propositional logic, focusing on those connections between sentences.
and for you, the learner, hopefully grasping these fundamental concepts provides a really valuable framework, not just for history, but for clearer thinking, for analyzing arguments you encounter every single day.
Yeah, thinking about it in modern terms, you could almost say Aristotle gave us the tools to analyze the components, the parts within an argument.
While the Stoics started figuring out the rules for how those components connect and build up into larger, more complex chains of reasoning.
Which leads to a really interesting question for you to think about. How does this interplay, this kind of tension, between Aristotle's focus on terms and the Stoics' focus on whole sentences, how does that continue to shape how we approach language and reasoning even today?
Right. What are the strengths, maybe the limitations of each perspective when we're trying to make sense of, the fire hose of complex information we face constantly? Are we focusing on the right parts or the right connections?
Exactly. Something to ponder. We definitely encourage you to explore the intricacies of these ancient logical systems further and consider just how relevant their quest for clear reasoning still is in our world.